There are two major threats to your faithfulness to God. The first is the storms of life we discussed in Lesson 1. These storms often threaten to overwhelm and shipwreck our faiths quickly. The second major threat is the current that's at work in our lives. Just as there is a current in the oceans that work to pull things away from shore, little by little, there are forces at work in this world that are trying to pull Christians away from Jesus Christ. But, unlike the storms, these often work very gradually over an extended period of time. The threat we face with this current then is slowly drifting away from God. Hebrews chapter 2 verses 1 through 4 identifies this real threat to our faiths. It says, "For this reason we must pay attention all the more to what we have heard, so that we will not drift away. For if the message spoken through angels was legally binding and every transgression and disobedience received a just punishment, how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? This salvation had its beginning when it was spoken of by the Lord, and it was confirmed to us by those who heard him. At the same time, God also testified by wonders, or by signs and wonders, various miracles and distributions of gifts from the Holy Spirit according to his will." Fortunately, the anchor God has given us also helps us not to drift away in the current that's trying to pull us back into the ocean of sin. Again, Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 19 identifies our anchor, saying, "We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain." This anchor is the hope of eternal salvation in heaven through Jesus Christ. In this second lesson, we need to recognize this additional threat of drifting. Although the storms of life may receive the most attention, the current we face may be even more dangerous. You see, the storms are much more easily identified than the current is. While we often realize when we're going through the storms and recognize our need to be strong during those moments, the current works every single day to try to pull you inches further from the Lord. And because it works so gradually, it can be difficult to realize it's happening. To help us think about drifting, we'll be considering Hebrews 2, verses 1 through 4, to gain a greater understanding of this threat and how we can fight against it. First, let's consider the process of drifting. There's a certain predictable process involved in drifting away from God. When the Hebrew writer spoke of drifting, he instructed us to pay attention all the more to what we have heard so that we would not drift away. Hebrews 2 and verse 1. Therefore, this tells me that the process of drifting is one that is characterized by carelessness. For it's not that the current is typically so strong that it overpowers anyone. Instead, it typically is only dangerous because people are not watching the threat and being as alert as they should be. So consider a 4-step process of drifting away. The first step of drifting is to ignore the threat. Some people treat drifting as if it is an irrelevant danger. As a result, they do not properly anchor themselves against the current. It's possible to ignore the threats of the current by thinking we are too strong to drift away from God, that it couldn't happen to us. Yet God has warned us. Look at 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12. "So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall." Remember that Satan is subtle and deceptive. He will often try to work discreetly so that you won't recognize that you're being tempted. In fact, I believe Satan knows that many Christians will not completely renounce their faith in a single instant because of a single temptation. However, many Christians are not fastened to their anchor so securely that they're fully protected against drifting, possibly because they have ignored this threat and all the ways Satan can use this threat against them. Second, After ignoring the problem and being slowly pulled away from God, the next step of drifting is to deny the problem. It has been said that sin takes us further than we wanted to go, keeps us longer than we wanted to stay, and costs us more than we were willing to pay. Think about how one moment a boat seems safe, resting partly on the shore, and then through an almost imperceptible ebb and flow of the tide, the boat goes from being partly on the shore to completely in the water, to a few feet off the shore, to a short distance from the shore, to a mile away from the shore, to being out of sight. Somewhere in the process, people usually tend to notice, but sometimes they deny there's a problem. On a spiritual level, I think this same thing happens whenever Satan convinces us to compromise our values inch by inch, perhaps not realizing the real impact of what we're doing. And then because the digression happened in such small increments, people often deny that they have done anything wrong. I think King David is a good example of this. David was called a man after God's own heart, Acts 13, verse 22. Almost certainly, Satan would have had great difficulty in getting this kind of man, to go miles away from God in a single instant by tempting him to murder. But rather than tempting David to commit murder as a first attempt to lure him from God, he began inching David from God. Go read 2 Samuel 11. First, Satan was successful in getting David to lust after a woman he saw. Second, Satan got David to inquire about her. Third, Satan got David to send for her after he knew she was another man's wife. Fourth, Satan got David to commit adultery with her. Fifth, Satan got David to act deceptively in trying to cover his sinful tracks. And sixth, whenever David's plans failed, Satan got David to effectively murder the woman's husband and other Israelite soldiers. And then 2 Samuel 12 indicates that David had apparently denied the problem the whole time. For it was not until after Nathan the prophet opened David's eyes to the fact that he had left the Lord that David repented. Third, after beginning to drift from God, many justify the situation. There's usually a point at which the problem of our drifting is finally brought to our attention, either because we recognize it or someone brings it to our attention. Yet there are many who will justify their drifting and continue to inch further and further away from God. They often think it happens to all of us, or I'm really not that far away. So rather than viewing their departure from the safety of the shore as being spiritually deadly, they have viewed their sin as being no big deal. David's predecessor, King Saul, is an example of one who justified his drifting. God had commanded Saul to completely destroy all the Amalekites and the things they had. Go read 1 Samuel 15. Yet Saul and the people spared King Agag and the best of their animals and what they had, only destroying what they considered to be worthless. Whenever God confronted Saul about this error, Saul initially denied he had done anything wrong. And then he tried to justify the situation by claiming he was going to sacrifice what he had spared to the Lord. 1 Samuel 15 and verse 15. Yet God was not pleased with his justification. Fourth, the final step of drifting is to fully embrace the new reality. Although it's possible to stay in the previous stages, at some point, many people do eventually look up long enough to notice that they have drifted and admit it to themselves. Yet there are many who just embrace their new reality rather than seek to correct it. By this time, they may have drifted so far away from the Lord that they just claim that their lives have gone in a new direction. Some who reach this point believe they have been enlightened and progressed in their thinking. Maybe there's no better example than Judas Iscariot. Here is a man who was one of Jesus' 12 apostles. He spent time near Jesus. He heard Jesus teach, saw Jesus' love and compassion, and witnessed Jesus' miracles. Yet, Satan entered Judas's heart so that Judas conspired to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And then Judas led a mob of Jesus' enemies to arrest him and identify Jesus to them by kissing him. This resulted in Jesus being crucified. Whenever Judas saw that Jesus had been condemned, he was sorrowful and returned the silver. However, recognizing he had drifted from Jesus, he embraced this new reality rather than correcting it by killing himself. Go read Matthew 27, verses 3 through 10. Next, let's consider the causes of drifting. Satan wants to catch us in the currents of life and influence us to drift away from God. And he does not want us to recognize the problem until we think it's too late to change, or until we are so set in our new ways that we simply will not change. So we need to be aware of the causes of drifting in our own lives. Therefore, let's consider a sample of what the current that is trying to pull us away from God looks like today. First, Satan is using false religious teaching to cause people to drift away. You see, Satan's okay with you being religious and even considering people to be Christians as long as they're believing a lie or not truly following God. In fact, the scriptures even demonstrate that Satan and his servants get involved in religion, albeit false religion. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13 through 15. But God warns true Christians about the need to grow in the faith and knowledge of Jesus Christ and reach spiritual maturity so that we will no longer be little children tossed by the waves and blown around by every wind of teaching, by human cunning with cleverness and the techniques of deceit. Ephesians 4, verse 14. Satan tries to inch people away from Jesus Christ or keep people from getting closer to him by exposing them to teachings that claim to be from the Bible, but really are not truth. At first, perhaps the Christian's on guard when he or she listens to these things, but through constant exposure to false ideas, many Christians and entire churches begin to drift away from the truth. Rather than their religion being based on the truth taught by God, their religion is based in some teacher or church. And many of these teachers and churches that falsely claim to teach truth and belong to Jesus Christ digress further and further from the truth over time. Second, Satan is using worldly wisdom to cause people to drift away. 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 through 21 says, "For the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but it is the power of God to us who are being saved. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will set aside the intelligence of the intelligent. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolish? For since in God's wisdom the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of what is preached." Satan loves to convince people that they know better than God. So Satan tries to get those who are Christians to accept the wisdom the world offers rather than the true wisdom from God. This wisdom is being taught all around us. It's taught in our schools. It's taught in the media. It's taught by our friends and family members and everywhere we look. Those who are not following Jesus Christ have determined that they know best regarding how this world came into existence and how life originated. They think they know what will produce a happy life better than God does. They think they know the meaning of life on earth better than God. And they think they can determine what is right and what is wrong without God. If Christians are not careful, constant exposure to such ideas can cause people to drift away from the truth God has revealed in the moral standard He approves. Third, Satan is using our peers to cause people to drift away. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33 warns, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." You see, one of the ways Satan gets us used to false ideas and sinful things is through the people around us, whether it be our family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors, classmates, or someone else. The people around us have a way of influencing us for the good or the bad. Certainly, if these people have not fully embraced the truths contained in the Bible, then they can influence us in the opposite direction. At first, those who are Christians may not be willing to accept some of their more extreme invitations to sin, but through constant pressure by the peers we want to be accepted by, the more willing many become to compromise the truth and practice error. Maybe a girlfriend or boyfriend wants you to go a little further than you're comfortable going. Maybe an unbelieving spouse gets you to forsake assembling with the local church just once. Maybe a coworker pressures you into accepting his or her beliefs rather than standing for God's truth. Maybe a classmate pressures you into having just one drink of alcohol. And then once you've done that one thing, the pressure's on to do the next thing. Or another one of your peers is pressuring you to do something else that's pulling you 1 inch further away from God than you've already went. Fourth, Satan is using culture to cause people to drift away. You see, Christians are warned that this world largely rejects God. In contrast between Christians and the world, 1 John 5 and verse 19 says, "We know that we are of God, and the whole world is under the sway of the evil one." The ways of the world are different from the ways of God. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. This is true about any culture in any community at any point of time. So, while Christians live in the world, we must not be conformed to the world. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. But this is a great challenge, for Satan is constantly using cultural influences around us to challenge how we think and act. At first, those who are Christians may recognize the fact that the ways of the world are different from what they stand for as Christians. But over time, the world can pressure Christians into becoming desensitized to wickedness. One of the most effective ways the world inches Christians away from Jesus Christ is through media and culture. So as Christians watch television programs and movies that are written and produced by those who do not share biblical values, they are introduced and desensitized to ideas that are contrary to God's ways. The same is true with books, music, magazines, blogs, games, and other forms of entertainment Christians choose to participate in. And very slowly, sin is presented as being not so bad and actually kind of enjoyable. Over time and exposure to various elements within a sinful culture, Christians can find their values and beliefs completely changed to look more and more like the world. Fifth, Satan is using daily distractions to cause people to drift away. For example, there's an interesting story in Luke 10, verses 38 through 42, that describes how two women, Mary and Martha, responded to the daily distractions they faced. When Jesus came to their home and they both had the opportunity to sit and learn from him, the text reveals that while Mary chose to learn from Jesus, Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So by focusing on these things, perhaps cleaning the house, preparing a meal, or other daily activities, she missed the greater opportunity to learn from God. While there are many things that need done in our lives and should not be neglected, Satan wants these worldly things to seem more important than they are, and for them to push God out of our lives little by little. He wants you to have little time and energy remaining to focus on, serve, and worship God. While we live in this world, it's very easy to get consumed by the things that make up our earthly lives so that we lose sight of what really matters. So as bills mount, maybe we put our jobs ahead of God, and attending church services or fulfilling the roles in our families just until we can catch up and get a little bit ahead. As we run from one activity to another for our children, maybe we fail to study the Bible, teach our children the ways of God, pray, be involved in teaching the gospel, attend church services, etc., as we should until things calm down. The point is that it's very easy to make one compromise after another with very little thought while we react to the daily grind of earthly life. However, Christians must make a choice to serve the Lord first rather than getting caught up in this constant drift away from God. Now, while I'm sure that there are other things Satan is using to get people to slowly drift away from God, we must recognize the danger involved in them all. Though we have seen that these causes of drifting are dangerous because they're often small and subtle movements away from God that can go unnoticed, we also need to recognize that even these so-called small digressions make an eternal difference. Let's notice the two dangers of drifting identified in Hebrews 2, verses 1 through 4. First, notice that those who drift away will receive a just punishment. Listen to Hebrews 2, verses 2 through 4 again. For if the message spoken through angels was legally binding in every transgression and disobedience received a just punishment, how will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? This salvation had its beginning when it was spoken of by the Lord, and it was confirmed to us by those who heard him. At the same time, God also testified by signs and wonders, various miracles and distributions of gifts from the Holy Spirit according to his will. The point is made that if sinning under the law of Moses, which was spoken through angels, as you see in Galatians 3 and verse 19, resulted in being punished, we should certainly not expect to escape God's punishment if we sin and neglect the great salvation that has now been made available through Jesus Christ. So, reflect over some of the people who were punished for sinning against God in the Old Testament. Think about Nadab and Abihu being destroyed by fire from God for using unauthorized fire in a sacrifice, Leviticus 10 verses 1 through 2. Think about Korah and those who rebelled against God with him being swallowed by the earth, Numbers 16. There are many examples. And then, if any Christian drifts away from God, he or she should not expect a lesser punishment. In fact, God has promised that those who are not faithful to him will spend eternity in hellfire. 2 Thessalonians 1 verses 7 through 9 warns that those who do not know God and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, that is the law of the New Testament, will experience the vengeance of God and pay the penalty of eternal destruction from the Lord's presence and from his glorious strength, being eternally separated from God and the fires of hell. Then second, notice that those who drift away neglect such a great salvation. So the danger of drifting away is not just that the drifter will experience a great punishment. Instead, it is also that the drifter will miss out on the great salvation God has provided through Jesus Christ in heaven. Surely then, those who have had once tasted the salvation offered by Jesus Christ and drifted away from it so as to be eternally lost in hellfire will experience a worse punishment than others because they will know that they forfeited salvation for the things on the earth. Although I don't believe the fires of hell will burn any hotter for these Christians who drifted from Christ, the anguish will likely be intensified because of their knowledge of what they gave up. Listen to 2 Peter 2, verses 20 through 22. It says, "For if, having escaped the world's impurity through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in these things and defeated, the last state is worse for them than the first. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than, after knowing it, to turn back from the holy command delivered to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a washed sow returns to wallowing in the mud. And then finally, let's consider the solution to drifting. Drifting is spiritually deadly. Many people will spend eternity in hell because they have allowed the current Satan uses to cause them to drift away. Thankfully, there's a solution to this great danger. Ultimately, the anchor God has provided through Jesus Christ is strong enough to keep us securely fastened to God despite the current that tries to pull us away from Him. However, we must do two things to overcome these challenges. First, we must be observant. As we have seen, one of the problems involved in drifting is that it's difficult to recognize that we're drifting whenever it's happening. So we need to practice regular and honest self-evaluation to see whether or not we have drifted from God. 2 Corinthians 13 verse 5 says, "Test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Examine yourselves, or do you yourselves not recognize that Jesus Christ is in you, unless you fail the test?" We need to make these self-evaluations, to look up from the individual moments in our lives and see the trajectory our lives are on. Are we truly living for God and growing in our faith according to what God has revealed in the Bible, or are we drifting from Him little by little? But these evaluations must be performed with complete honesty. They simply will not help us if we deceive ourselves. One way you can arrive at the proper evaluation of your life's trajectory, that is, whether you're maturing in the faith or getting weaker, is to look at your fruit. Jesus said, "Either make the tree good and its fruit will be good, or make the tree bad and its fruit will be bad. For a tree is known by its fruit." Matthew 12, verse 33. So the fruit your life produces will demonstrate your heart. And in another place, Jesus also helps us learn that our spiritual fruit production for God ought to increase the longer we are Christians. John 15, verses 1 through 8. Therefore, honestly evaluate your life for Christ to see if you are improving in your service and producing more fruit, or whether your fruit demonstrates that you are drifting from Christ. Second, we must be careful. Anytime we observe that we are drifting, we need to exercise careful diligence to return to the Lord completely. Again, Hebrews 2 verse 1 says, "For this reason we must pay attention all the more to what we have heard, so that we will not drift away." Careful attention must be given to our present situation if we have drifted. Just as carelessness is behind our drifting away, carefulness is the key to returning to Christ. It will take great diligence to return to Jesus Christ. Remember, the currents in this world pull us away from Christ, not toward Him. So we'll need to get to work, rowing against the current of life, holding to the truths that God has revealed in His Word. You must be careful to make the necessary corrections to the areas in which you have sinned. Honestly evaluate the areas of sin that are in your life and change them, no matter the cost. And then you must also be careful to do the things God wants you to do. God doesn't just want you to avoid doing some things. He wants you also to do some things. He wants you to study His Word every day. He wants you to join a faithful local church and attend all the assemblies that you possibly can. He wants you to teach people the gospel. He wants you to do good to others. He wants you to let your light shine. There are many things you must be careful to do. And you must also be careful to anchor yourself in hope. Once you return from drifting, you must put your anchor down firmly so that you will not get caught up in the current again. carefully and diligently resisting Satan in the future. So in conclusion, the currents of this life are trying to pull every Christian away from God. Some currents are stronger than others. But as we learn from Hebrews 2 verses 1 through 4, it is possible to refuse to get caught up in the currents and live for Jesus. If we will cast our anchors and hold firmly to them, we will not be caught drifting when our earthly lives end. And if you have discovered that you have drifted away from God, today is the day. You must get yourself back into a right relationship with God through Jesus Christ. You do not have to be overcome by any of the storms or currents of this life. You can overcome and be victorious through Jesus Christ. We have an anchor for the soul.